What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and if you are new here, buckle up, because today we are talking about the most shocking, the most polarizing, the most absolutely jaw-dropping front office move in recent Toronto Maple Leafs history. And trust me, for a franchise that has given us drama every single offseason for the past 2 decades, that is saying something. Because on May 3rd, 2026, the Toronto Maple Leafs officially introduced John Chayka as their new general manager. And the hockey world absolutely lost its mind. Let that sink in for a second. John Chayka, in Toronto, running the most scrutinized franchise in all of hockey. The man who walked away from the Arizona Coyotes in the middle of a playoff bubble. The man who was at the center of one of the most controversial tenures in recent NHL history. That guy is now sitting in the GM chair at Scotiabank Arena, and whether you love it or hate it, and trust me, people have very, very strong opinions, you cannot deny that this story is absolutely wild from start to finish. So let's go back. Let's lay out exactly how we got here, because the context matters enormously. The Leafs just wrapped up a 2025-26 season that can only be described as a catastrophe. A 32-36-14 record, 8th in the Atlantic Division, missing the playoffs for the first time since 2016. The same core that had carried the weight of an entire fanbase's dreams for nearly a decade, Austin Matthews, William Nylander, John Tavares, and the result was a collapse that nobody in Leaf Nation saw coming at that magnitude. They gave up 299 goals. They lost Mitch Marner's production and never replaced it. The Craig Berube system never clicked. And by the end of March, Brad Treliving was fired. Done. Gone. And the Leafs were in full-blown crisis mode. Now, in moments like that, franchises have a choice. They can go safe. They can go proven. They can hire the reassuring veteran voice who checks all the boxes in a traditional search. Or they can go bold. They can take a swing that makes the rest of the league stop and stare. And Keith Pelly, the Leafs team president and CEO, he swung. He swung hard. He picked up the phone and eventually landed on John Chayka, a 36-year-old Ontario native who had been away from the NHL front office scene for years, built a restaurant empire with his wife. We're talking 236 Wendy's locations and 5 Tim Hortons franchises, which only in Canada, and who was now being handed the keys to the most storied franchise in hockey. The press conference on May 4th was something else. They brought out Matt Sundin, one of the most beloved Maple Leafs of all time, as a senior executive advisor, almost as if to say, look, we know who we're hiring, here's your safety blanket. And still, the questions were brutal. A reporter from the Toronto Sun asked Pelly directly how he responded to those around the league who were calling the Chayka hiring a sham. Pelly barely flinched. I must have talked to different people, he said. He kept coming back to one phrase, deep due diligence. He claimed to have no concerns about Chayka's past and said the process was thorough and deliberate. But let's be honest, not everyone was buying it. Because here's the thing about John Chayka. The story of his career is not simple. When he was hired by the Arizona Coyotes back in 2016 at 26 years old, it was genuinely historic. The youngest GM in NHL history, a data analytics pioneer, a guy who was going to drag the sport into the modern era. And there was something real about that vision. But the 4 years that followed in Arizona were messy, chaotic, and ultimately ended in the most bizarre fashion you could imagine. The Coyotes compiled a 131-147-38 record under his watch. Their only playoff appearance came during the COVID bubble, and Chayka resigned, literally stepped away from his own team, right before that bubble tournament began. That moment alone created enemies across the league. And then it got worse. It emerged that the Coyotes under Chayka's management had conducted illegal pre-draft testing of prospects, something strictly prohibited by the league. Arizona was forced to forfeit a second-round pick in 2020 and a first-round pick in 2021. That is an enormous price to pay. And those penalties followed Chayka's name everywhere. For years after his departure, he stayed away from NHL front offices entirely. The restaurant business became his world. Some people assumed he was done with hockey at the executive level forever. But Chayka himself was clear at that Toronto press conference. He acknowledged that questions about his past were inevitable. He wasn't trying to dodge the history. He said he was focused on starting a new chapter for himself and for the Maple Leafs. And here is where it gets really interesting, because once you actually look at what Chayka has done since taking over in Toronto, the narrative starts to shift fast. Because John Chayka did not walk into Scotiabank Arena and wait around. He immediately got to work reshaping an organization that had been stuck in the same loop for nearly a decade. And the moves he made were anything but timid. The first major shock came when the Leafs won the NHL draft lottery and secured the first overall pick. A massive piece of fortune that nobody saw coming. And Chayka used it to select Gavin McKenna out of Penn State, described by scouts as the most electrifying offensive prospect in the world outside of the NHL. Pairing McKenna alongside Austin Matthews? That is the kind of vision play that makes a fan base dream again. Then free agency opened, and Chayka went to work in a way Toronto has not seen in years. He signed Sergei Bobrovsky, two-time Stanley Cup champion, to bring championship pedigree to the crease. He added Jack Roslovic, Colton Sissons, Teddy Bluger, and Brandon Duheim to completely reshape the bottom six identity of this team. He acquired Nick Paul from Tampa Bay in a trade that sent Dennis Hildeby to the Lightning. He hired Jim Hiller as the 41st head coach in franchise history, bringing in fresh tactical energy behind the bench. He cleaned house in the scouting department. He changed virtually every area of the organization: management, coaching, player personnel, development, and he did it all in barely 2 months. Now, the criticism is real, and we have to be fair about it. Chayka replaced a group that combined for 86 goals and 170 points last season with veterans who produced just 47 goals and 88 points. On paper, if you just look at the offensive production numbers from last year compared to this new group, the Leafs look like they got worse. But the people who know what Chayka is actually building say that is entirely the wrong lens. This was never about replacing production point for point. This was about changing the identity of a team that had become soft in its own zone, unable to play a physical, responsible game when it mattered most in the playoffs. The Leafs under Chayka are supposed to be harder to play against, grittier, more committed in the defensive zone, and then let Matthews, Nylander, and McKenna provide the offensive firepower from the top. The goaltending question is the one genuine wild card. Bobrovsky is 38 years old. He had a disappointing 2025-26 season in Florida before this move. Can he rediscover his form? Can he channel the same version of himself that won back-to-back cups? That is the great unknown hanging over this entire roster rebuild. If Bobrovsky is Bobrovsky, the Leafs are a legitimate threat. If he has already peaked, the entire goaltending strategy unravels. And there is the shadow of his past that will follow Chayka into every transaction, every draft pick, every move. The hockey world has long memories. Former Arizona Coyotes legend Shane Doan, a man who gave his entire career to that franchise, was among those who reacted strongly to the news. Doan was famously fired by Chayka in 2017 over breakfast at a restaurant in Scottsdale. An 8-minute meeting that ended Doan's connection to the only organization he had ever known. The pain of that moment has stayed with people in Arizona for years, and the news of Chayka landing one of the most powerful GM jobs in hockey brought all of that back to the surface immediately. But here is what makes this story so compelling, so genuinely difficult to reduce to a simple verdict. John Chayka is back. He did not give up. He spent years building outside of hockey, staying sharp, staying patient, and waiting for the moment when someone would be willing to bet on him again. And Keith Pelly, for better or for worse, made that bet. In one of the most demanding hockey markets on the planet. With one of the most passionate, most demanding fan bases in all of professional sports watching every single move. If Chayka gets this right, if the McKenna pick turns into a franchise cornerstone, if Bobrovsky has one more great year in him, if this new team identity actually holds in the playoffs, then the redemption arc writes itself and people will be talking about this moment as the turning point that saved the Maple Leafs. And if it goes wrong, if the cracks show, if the same chaotic energy that defined his Arizona tenure resurfaces in Toronto, then it becomes the most catastrophic misfire the Leafs have made in a generation of misfires. There is no middle ground here. Not in Toronto. Not with this much riding on one hire. What we can say right now is this. For the first time in a long time, the Maple Leafs are genuinely unpredictable. They have a vision that is different from anything Dubas or Trey Living built. They have a first overall pick who could be a superstar. They have a coach no one expected. And they have a general manager who the entire hockey world is watching. Some waiting for him to prove everyone wrong, and others waiting for exactly what they predicted. John Chayka has arrived in Toronto, and whatever happens next, it is going to be one of the most fascinating chapters this franchise has ever written. That much nobody can argue. Make sure you like and subscribe if you want to stay on top of every move this team makes this summer and heading into the 2026-27 season. Because I promise you, with Chayka running this show, the news is not going to slow down anytime soon. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Are you buying in on Chayka, or are you still not sold? I want to hear from every single one of you. I'll see you in the next one.